The Nebraska prairie doesn't give a damn about your morals. Out here, under a sky so big it can swallow a man whole, there are only two real choices: survival or a shallow, unmarked grave. For Elizabeth Monroe, Elsie, to the few who knew her, survival was a religion. It was a daily sacrament she earned with the cold logic of gunpowder and the patient steel of her iron traps. She read the land like scripture, knew its moods and its secrets. She'd made a hard peace with the solitude, a peace bought with the life of her husband Thomas, 3 winters gone. Now it was just her, a sturdy log cabin, and a skill with a Winchester that was damn near supernatural. But on this one Tuesday morning, with the sun just a bloody knife wound on the eastern horizon, her trap line offered a third choice, a choice far more damnable than life or death. Caught in the cold, unforgiving jaws of a snare wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a fox. It was a child, a Pawnee boy. Her decision in that one heart-stopping moment, a simple act of mercy born from an instinct she thought long dead, was like striking a match in a room full of dynamite. It would light a fuse that stretched from her isolated cabin all the way to the heart of a proud warrior nation. And it promised a reckoning that would arrive with the setting sun. The cold was a physical thing. It wasn't just in the air. It was a presence, a predator that seeped through the thick wool of her coat and laid its teeth deep in her bones. It was a familiar cold, the kind that meant the day would be clear and hard and unforgiving. The year was 1871, and the Nebraska Territory was still a place of brutal, simple truths. Elsie moved with the quiet, efficient economy of someone who had spent too much time alone. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man, a strong man, but the fever didn't care about strength. It took him and left her with this cabin, this land, and a silence that had become her only companion. Her face, framed by strands of sun-bleached brown hair that had escaped their tight bun, was a roadmap of her life. Lines etched by the sun, by worry, by the endless, lonely horizon. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and right now they were scanning the landscape with a practiced, sweeping gaze. Something was wrong. The usual pre-dawn chatter of the coyotes was gone. The air was still, heavy, like it was holding its breath. As she walked her line, a flock of grouse exploded from a thicket of wild plum, their frantic wing beats the only sound in the world besides the crunch of her worn leather boots on the frosted earth. The first snare was empty. The second, too. The third, the same. A flicker of disappointment, but nothing more. Pelt prices were good, and a few beaver or fox would see her through the next supply run to Redemption Bluffs, the sorry excuse for a town that clung to life a half-day's ride away. It was at the fourth snare that the silence was finally broken. The snare was tucked cunningly into a game trail that wound through a shallow, cottonwood-choked ravine. And the sound wasn't the thrashing of a panicked animal. It was a soft, rhythmic whimper, a pained, desperate sound that was terrifyingly, unmistakably human. Instinct took over. Elsie's hand dropped, smooth as water, to the Colt Peacemaker holstered on her hip. She moved low, her body sinking below the level of the sagebrush, her eyes scanning the shadows. The rising sun was playing tricks, casting long, distorted shapes that danced and writhed at the edge of her vision. And then she saw it. The snare, a cruel, tight loop of braided wire, was cinched around the ankle of a small boy. He was Pawnee. His dark hair was matted with dirt and sweat, his face streaked with tears that had frozen on his copper skin. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, dressed in simple buckskin leggings and a shirt that were no match for the biting cold. He'd stopped pulling against the wire. Exhaustion had won. He just lay there shivering, one small hand clutching the swollen, bloody mess where the wire had cut down to the bone. A dread colder and sharper than the morning air washed over Elsie. This wasn't just trouble. This was a death warrant. Tensions between the settlers of Redemption Bluffs and the Pawnee bands were at a knife's edge. A dead cow, a missing horse. Every little incident was a spark threatening to ignite a prairie fire of unimaginable violence. A Pawnee child, maimed or killed in a white woman's trap. It wouldn't be a spark. It would be a declaration of war. And she, the lonely widow on the ridge, would be ground zero. Her first instinct was primal. Turn back, run, pretend she saw nothing. Let the prairie solve its own problems. It was the smart move, the survivor's move. But then the boy whimpered again. It was a sound of pure, helpless misery, a sound that cut straight through her fear and her pragmatism and struck something deep inside her, something she thought the fever had buried with Thomas. It was the sound her own son might have made, had he lived past his second birthday. Damn it all to hell, she cursed under her breath. She holstered her pistol. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up, raising her hands to show they were empty. The boy's dark eyes snapped open, wide with a terror that was absolute. He scrambled backward, pulling against the snare, and let out a sharp, piercing cry of pain. Easy now, Elsie said, her voice soft but steady. I'm not going to hurt you. Easy. The words were meaningless to him. He was a child of the plains. He knew that kindness from a white stranger was a currency rarely traded and usually a trick. But she hoped the tone, the calm in her voice, would get through. She took one slow step forward. He flinched, his body coiled like a snake ready to strike. She stopped. Slowly she knelt, unhooking the water canteen from her belt. She held it out. His eyes darted from the canteen to her face, then back again, searching for the angle, the trap within the trap. She unscrewed the cap and set the canteen on the ground, sliding it gently across the frosted dirt toward him. He watched it, his breathing shallow and rapid. For a long, stretched moment, the world seemed to stop. Then his thirst won out over his fear. He crab-crawled toward it, snatched it up, and drank greedily, spilling water down his chin in his haste. While he was distracted, Elsie moved closer, inch by agonizing inch. Let me see, she murmured, gesturing to his mangled ankle. He recoiled, pulling the leg back protectively, a low growl rumbling in his chest. She sighed. This wasn't working. She pulled the heavy skinning knife from the sheath on her belt. The boy's eyes widened again, the terror returning in a fresh, hot wave. He thought she was going to finish the job the trap had started. No, no, she said, shaking her head emphatically. She pointed the tip of the knife at the taut wire around his ankle, then made a sharp cutting motion in the air. For the wire, she said, her voice firm. Understand? The wire. She didn't wait for an answer. With a swift, sure movement, she positioned the thickest part of the blade against the braided wire and pressed down. Hard. It was tough, well-made wire. She had to put all her weight into it, gritting her teeth as the steel bit and scraped against the metal. The boy watched, silent and still, his fate resting in the strength of this strange white woman's arms. With a final, sharp snap, the wire parted. The boy gasped as the pressure released, cradling his injured ankle. It was a nasty wound. The wire had sliced deep, and the flesh around it was already turning a dark, angry purple. Infection was almost a certainty if it wasn't cleaned, and out here, infection was just a slower name for death. Elsie stood and backed away, giving him space. She reached into a leather pouch on her belt and took out two things: a small strip of clean linen she kept for emergencies, and a precious piece of dried jerky. She placed them on the ground where the canteen had been. She looked the boy directly in the eye, then pointed east, in the general direction the Pawnee were known to camp. Go, she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. Go home. The boy stared at her, his young face a mask of confusion, pain, and a dawning, reluctant understanding. He pushed himself up, testing his injured leg. He couldn't put any weight on it. Using a nearby cottonwood sapling for support, he managed to stand. He glanced back at the offering on the ground, then at her. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Then, clutching the jerky, he began to limp away, hopping on his good leg, a small, solitary figure, disappearing into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the prairie. Elsie watched until he was gone, a knot of pure dread tightening in her stomach. She had done the right thing. She was sure of it. But in this land, the right thing often came with the highest price. She turned to examine the broken snare, intending to discard it far from her line, and that's when her blood ran cold. A detail, small but significant, snagged her attention. The wire. It was thinner, more tightly braided than the kind she used. And the anchoring peg, driven deep into the hard-packed earth, was fashioned from hickory wood. She always used ash. A cold, sickening realization trickled down her spine. This wasn't her snare. Someone had deliberately set it on her trapline. Someone wanted this to happen. Someone wanted to start a war, and they had chosen her to be the spark. A faint sound, the distant clink of a horseshoe on rock, made her freeze. Her head snapped up. Peering through the tangle of cottonwood branches, she saw them. Two riders sitting on the ridge overlooking the ravine. They were too far to identify, but they weren't Pawnee. They wore hats and carried rifles. They were settlers. One of them pointed down directly at her. Elsie didn't wait. She didn't think. She scrambled out of the ravine, keeping low, moving fast, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't look back. The act of mercy was over. The fight for her life had just begun. Redemption Bluffs was a town born of desperation, and named with an irony its founders were too grim to appreciate. It was little more than a single dusty street flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, all leaning on each other for support against the relentless prairie wind. It held a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office that doubled as a jail. For Elsie, it was a necessary evil, a place to trade furs for flour, salt, and bullets, and to remind herself that other people still existed. By the time she reached the outskirts, the sun was high and unforgiving. She'd circled wide around the spot where she'd seen the riders, her mind racing, piecing together the ugly puzzle. Someone had planted that snare. Someone wanted trouble, and they wanted that trouble to land squarely at her cabin door. She tied her weary mare, Bess, to the hitching post outside Higgins's general store. The familiar smell of sawdust, cured meats, and stale tobacco spilled out into the street. Inside, the store's proprietor, Bartholomew Bart Higgins, was polishing the glass on his candy jar. He was a portly man with a fringe of gray hair and the perpetual look of a man who expected bad news at any moment. "Morning, Elsie," he said, his eyes flicking over her dusty state. "Rough trip?" "The usual," she lied, her voice tight. She leaned against the counter, trying to appear calm. "Need flour, coffee, and a box of 4440 cartridges." As Bart gathered her supplies, the door swung open, its bell jingling ominously. Two men entered, their spurs clinking with an air of self-importance. The first was Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority seemed to shrink with his hairline. He was tired, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a tin star. He seemed fundamentally ill-suited to wear. He was a man who preferred peace, not out of principle, but out of a deep-seated fear of confrontation. The man beside him, however, was another animal entirely. Deputy Hiram Kane walked with a coiled, predatory energy that seemed to suck the air out of the room. He was handsome in a sharp, cruel way, with a chiseled jaw, pale, watchful eyes, and a confident smile that never, ever reached them. He was a newer arrival in the territory, a man who spoke of progress and investment, but whose actions hinted at a more personal, ruthless ambition. And he was the one who had been steadily, deliberately stoking the town's fear of the Pawnee, painting them as savages who stood in the way of prosperity. His prosperity. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Kane said, his voice as smooth as oiled leather. He tipped his hat to Elsie. "Mrs. Monroe, good to see you haven't been scalped yet." Elsie's jaw tightened. "My hair is right where I left it, Deputy." "For now," Kane said, his smile widening. He leaned a hip against a barrel of pickles, making himself comfortable. "Another of Franklin's cattle turned up dead this morning, torn to shreds. Wolf, Franklin says. But we all know wolves don't use arrows." There had been no arrow. Elsie knew it. Kane knew it. But the lie was planted, and she saw Bart Higgins's eyes grow wider. This was how Kane operated. Insinuation and fear. He was a poison, seeping into the town's well of common sense. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, a nervous, fluttering sound. "Now, Hiram, we don't know for sure it was them. Who else?" Kane shot back, his voice hardening, dropping the smooth pretense. "They're getting bolder. Raiding parties, they say, coming closer to the settlement every day. They see our farms. They see our women." He let his gaze linger on Elsie for a fraction of a second too long. a subtle, possessive flicker that made her skin crawl. They want what we have. It's their nature. We need to show them this land is ours now. Draw a line in the dirt, with blood if need be. Elsie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning's temperature. The speech was practiced, honed. It was designed to turn simple unease into frothing hatred. She paid Bart for her supplies, her only thought to get out of the store, away from the toxic air Kane created around him. "You run your lines out by the Whispering Ravine, don't you, Mrs. Monroe?" Kane asked, his tone deceptively casual. Elsie's heart gave a painful, heavy thump against her ribs. "Sometimes." "Best be careful," he said, his eyes boring into hers, searching. "That's contested ground. A lone woman out there. It's a risk. You happen to see anything unusual this morning?" It was a test. He was fishing, trying to see if she'd taken the bait he'd so carefully laid. She had to play this perfectly. She couldn't let him know she suspected him, but she couldn't lie outright. A bad lie was always worse than the truth. "Nothing but a scarcity of foxes," she said, her voice flat and cold as riverstone. She hefted her sack of flour. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I have a long ride back." She turned to leave, her body rigid, but as she passed Kane, her eyes snagged on the handle of the hunting knife sheathed on his belt. It was a custom piece, ornate and well cared for. The pommel was made from a polished piece of dark, rich hickory, the same wood as the peg that had anchored the snare. Her blood didn't just run cold. It froze solid in her veins. The air rushed from her lungs. The sounds of the store, Bart humming, the creak of the floorboards, faded into a dull roar. It was him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Kane had set the trap. He wasn't just stirring up trouble with words. He was manufacturing it with wire and wood, using her trap line as his personal stage. He had likely intended to catch a coyote or a wolf, something he could drag into town and claim was Pawnee poaching, another log on the fire he was building. But a child had stumbled into his scheme, a complication that made his sick game infinitely more dangerous for everyone. And the two riders on the ridge this morning, it had to have been him and Brody, checking the trap, coming to see if their plan had worked. She stumbled out into the harsh sunlight, her mind piecing it all together with sickening speed. Kane wanted the Pawnee gone. A war would solve his problem. If the tribe retaliated for the injured child, a child injured on her land, in a trap that looked like hers, the army would be called in from Fort Kearney. The Pawnee would be driven out or wiped out. And the land, their ancestral land, would be free for men like him to claim, to parcel, to sell. And he had found the perfect scapegoat, the reclusive widow on the hill, the outsider, the woman nobody would miss. She untied Bess, her hands trembling slightly. She had to get back to the cabin. She had to think. But as she swung into the saddle, she saw Sheriff Brody exit the store, walking toward her. He looked uncomfortable, his gaze shifting around the dusty street as if looking for an escape. "Ma'am," he began, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands, "about what Hiram was saying, he can be a bit zealous." "He can be a liar," Elsie said, her voice low and sharp as a shard of glass. Brody flinched. "He's the deputy. He's sworn to protect this town." "Is he?" Elsie leaned forward in her saddle, her stormy eyes locking onto his. "Or is he trying to start a war for his own gain? You were with him this morning, weren't you? On the ridge above the ravine." Brody's face went pale, a sickly, chalky white. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a fish gasping for air. The lack of a denial was all the confirmation Elsie needed. He was weak. He was a coward, letting a man like Kane lead him around by the nose. "You'd best figure out which side you're on, Sheriff," Elsie said, pulling hard on Bess's reins. "Because a storm is coming, and Kane is the one seeding the clouds." She kicked the mare into a canter, leaving the sheriff standing alone in the middle of the street, a man trapped between his conscience and his fear. She rode hard, the sack of flour bumping against her leg. The supplies felt heavy, but not as heavy as the terrible truth she now carried. Kane had made his move. The Pawnee would surely make theirs. and she was standing on the ground where they were destined to meet. Miles to the east, in a hidden encampment nestled by a bend in the Loup River, the news arrived. It didn't come with a messenger's desperate shout, but with the painful, halting steps of a child. The boy, Tahi, finally collapsed at the edge of the village, his small body surrendering to the agony and exhaustion. It was his mother, Nituna, who saw him first. Her scream cut through the calm afternoon air like a blade, a sound of pure maternal anguish that brought the entire camp running. Within moments, the village was in turmoil. At the center of it all was Tahi's father, the war chief, Maka. Maka was a man forged by the prairie, tall and powerfully built, his face a stern mask that concealed a fierce protective love for his family and his people. He had earned his status not through birth, but through unshakable courage and a keen, strategic mind. He was a man who thought 3 steps ahead in any battle, but when he saw his son, his only son, lying on a buffalo robe, his ankle a mangled, bloody ruin, the strategist vanished. The war chief disappeared. Only a father remained. He knelt beside the boy, his large, calloused hand gently touching Tahi's forehead, which was slick with a feverish sweat. "What happened?" Maka's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder gathering on the horizon. Tahi, delirious with pain, could only offer fractured, terrifying pieces of the story. "A trap. Iron teeth," he whimpered, his eyes wide with the memory of the terror. "On the woman's path. The trapline woman." He spoke of the biting cold, the searing fear, the sharp, relentless bite of the wire. And then he spoke of the woman herself. He described her pale, stormy eyes, her sudden appearance from the sagebrush, the terrifying glint of her long knife in the morning sun. In his fevered, pain-addled state, the act of her cutting the wire became tangled and confused with the initial injury. He couldn't articulate the nuance, the mercy that had followed the terror. He could only convey the core, damning elements. A white woman, her trap, his pain. Maka's hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. The trapline woman. He knew of her, a solitary figure who lived on the ridge that overlooked their winter hunting grounds. His people had watched her, wary, but they had left her in peace as long as she kept to herself. But this was an attack, a deliberate act of aggression, a message. Nituna, weeping silently, began to clean the wound as best she could with boiled water and soft moss. As she worked, her fingers found the strip of clean linen Elsie had left, tucked carefully into the boy's leggings. It was clean, store-bought cloth. Beside it was the piece of jerky, untouched. She held them up. "Maka," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Look." It was Chata, the tribe's elder and spiritual leader, who spoke first. He was a man whose age was written in the deep canyons of his face, his eyes holding the long, patient wisdom of the changing seasons. He took the linen from Nituna, examining it closely. "This is a strange thing for an enemy to do," Chata said, his voice a calm anchor in the rising sea of anger. "The trap held him, but the woman's knife freed him. He has food from her pack and a clean bandage from her stores. The story the boy tells is clouded by pain. A she-wolf who wounds a fawn does not then lick its wounds clean." Maka, however, was deaf to reason. His grief and his rage were a storm in his chest, blinding him, deafening him. He saw only betrayal. He saw the ever-shrinking borders of their land, the settlers' cattle trampling their sacred grounds, and now their casual violence turning on his own child. "She licks the wound so the poison can sink in deeper," Maka snarled. He snatched the linen from Chata's hand and threw it to the ground. "It is a trick, a white devil's trick to make us seem weak, to show us they can harm our children and then offer a pittance as an apology. She set a trap for a Pawnee boy on Pawnee land. She will pay for it." He looked at the faces of the warriors gathering around him, their expressions grim, their hands resting on their weapons. He saw his own anger, his own frustration, reflected in their eyes. They had endured too many provocations, swallowed too much pride. This story of the maimed child was the final unbearable indignity. "The trapper on the ridge has drawn a line in the dirt," Maka declared, his voice ringing with the authority of a war chief. Tonight, we will show her where the Pawnee nation stands. We will burn her cabin to the ground and take a price for the blood of my son. Gather your arms. We ride at dusk. A roar of approval went up from the younger warriors. They were eager to prove their mettle, to unleash the fury that had been simmering for months. Chata placed a restraining hand on Maka's arm. A war chief's anger must be a tool, not a master, the old man warned, his voice low but firm. There is a foul wind blowing from the white man's town. I feel it. This may be the trap, and we are the ones walking into it. Let us first be certain who our true enemy is. Maka shook off the elder's hand, his eyes like chips of flint. I am certain, he said, his voice cold and final. My enemy is the one who harmed my son. By nightfall, she will know the fury of a Pawnee father. He turned and strode toward his lodge to retrieve his war lance and paint his face for battle. The decision was made. The tribe was gathering, not in council, not in celebration, but for vengeance. One by one, the warriors went to their lodges. The quiet, peaceful bustle of the camp was replaced by the grim, silent preparations for war. The sun began its slow descent, its golden light seeming to mock the darkness that was about to be unleashed upon the prairie. Nituna could only watch, clutching her son's feverish hand, praying to the spirits that the blood spilled tonight would not lead to an ocean of it tomorrow. The ride back to her cabin was a blur of frantic, heart-pounding energy for Elsie. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered war cry. She unsaddled Bess and turned her loose in the small corral, slapping her flank to send her to the far side, away from the cabin. It was a small gesture, maybe a futile one, but she wouldn't let her horse be a target. She barred the heavy plank door and shuttered the two small windows, plunging the single room into a gloomy, oppressive twilight. The cabin, which had always been her sanctuary, her fortress of solitude, now felt like a cage, a coffin. She was trapped. Cain had framed her perfectly, using her as the pawn in his deadly game. And the Pawnee, fueled by a father's righteous and understandable rage, were coming for her. They would see only the surface truth, their child, her trapline, the injury. They had no reason to look deeper, no reason to believe the word of a white woman over the cries of one of their own. Panic, cold and sharp, gnawed at the edges of her composure. She could run, saddle Bess and flee into the night, leave everything behind and never look back. But where would she go? Cain's lies would follow her. She'd be a fugitive, hunted by both sides. And some stubborn, defiant part of her, the part that had buried a husband and survived 3 brutal winters alone, refused to be run off her own land by a coward like Hiram Cain. This was her home, paid for with Thomas's sweat and her own resilience. She would not surrender it to a lie. Her fear began to recede, burned away by the cold, sharp flame of anger. If she was going to die here, tonight, it wouldn't be as a helpless victim cowering in the dark. She needed proof, something tangible, something that could cut through the rage and the confusion. Her mind raced back to the ravine, the snare, the hickory peg, Cain's knife. It was a connection, but it was flimsy. Her word against his. She needed more. The riders on the ridge, Cain and Brody, their horses. A sudden, desperate idea took hold. An idea so risky it was almost insane. But it was the only idea she had. She grabbed her Winchester rifle, unbarred the door, and slipped back out into the fading light. The sun was a fiery globe touching the western horizon, painting the clouds in violent shades of orange and purple. She had little time. She moved quickly, not back toward the ravine, but toward the trail that led to town, her eyes scanning the hard-packed dirt. She was a trapper. She knew how to read the land, how to see the stories left behind in the dust. The Pawnee rode unshod ponies, their hoofprints small and round. The settlers' horses wore iron shoes. Cain rode a big, heavy-set bay. She remembered seeing it hitched outside the sheriff's office. A horse like that would leave a distinct print. There, just off the main trail, where a rider might pull up to get a view of the surrounding land. She found them. 2 sets of prints. One was from a lighter horse, likely the sheriff's. The other was larger, deeper, and one of the horseshoes had a distinctive nick in the outer edge, a small imperfection, a chip in the iron that would act as a signature. She had seen that same nick before, in the dust outside the general store. It was Cain's horse. She knelt, her searching fingers brushing the dust. And then she found something else, half buried, glinting dully in the last rays of sunlight. It was a small flat brass button, tarnished and plain. It was identical to the buttons on the standard issue deputy coats worn by men like Cain. She remembered him in the store, gesturing with his hands as he delivered his hateful speech. She remembered seeing the cuff of his sleeve, and she remembered that it had been missing a button. She clutched the small piece of metal in her palm. It felt as heavy and as powerful as a loaded pistol. The peg, the horseshoe print, the button. It was a chain of evidence, forged in iron and brass and hickory. It wasn't just her word against a child's pain anymore. She had the truth in her hand. A flicker of movement on the far ridge brought her head up, a silhouette against the dying light. Then another, and another. They were here. Elsie's breath hitched in her throat. She scrambled back toward the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was out of time. She bolted the door again, her back pressed against the rough-hewn logs, listening. Through a tiny crack in the shutter, she watched as more figures appeared, silent as ghosts, ringing the low hill on which her cabin stood. They weren't charging. They were simply gathering, a ring of dark, patient predators encircling their prey. The last of the sunlight bled from the sky, and a profound, terrifying twilight descended. The prairie fell silent. No crickets, no coyotes. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. Inside the dim cabin, Elsie laid the brass button on the rough-hewn table. Beside it, she took a piece of charcoal from the cold hearth, and on a scrap of brown paper used for wrapping supplies, she quickly and accurately sketched the distinctive, nicked horseshoe print. She loaded her Winchester rifle and her Colt pistol, laying them on the table as well. The button, the drawing, the guns. Proof and power. But how could she possibly use them? To the men outside, she was a monster who harmed children. They had come for blood, not for a trial. The siege had begun. She was one woman, alone in a wooden box, surrounded by a warrior nation. And somewhere out there, in the gathering darkness, Hiram Cain was likely watching, smiling, waiting for the fire he had so carefully built to finally consume everything in its path. The night deepened into a vast, star-dusted blanket that offered no comfort, only a cold, indifferent beauty. The silence from outside the cabin was more unnerving than any war cry. It was a weighted silence, heavy with menace and deliberation. They were waiting, judging. Elsie sat at her table, the faint light of a single tallow candle casting long, flickering shadows on the walls that danced like tormented spirits. Her senses were stretched thin, strained to the breaking point. Every creak of the cabin's logs, every gust of wind against the shutters sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. Then a voice cut through the stillness. It was deep and resonant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a demand, a challenge, an indictment. Elsie moved silently to the crack in the shutter. In the pale moonlight, she could see a lone figure standing halfway down the slope. He was tall and powerfully built, holding a long, feather-adorned lance. Even from a distance, his presence radiated an authority that was absolute. This was the leader, the war chief, the father. "I am Maka," he called out, this time in the broken English used for trade and treaties. "You have taken blood from my son. We have come to take blood from you. Show your face, witch." The word hung in the air, venomous and final. Witch. To them, what had happened was an act of evil magic, a white woman's curse laid upon their child. It was simpler than the truth. Her hand rested on the cool, smooth stock of her Winchester. She could fight. She was a good shot, one of the best. She might take one or two of them with her before they overwhelmed her. But it was a fool's hope. The cabin would become her coffin, riddled with arrows and bullets. Her only real weapon wasn't the rifle on the table. It was the truth. But truth was a fragile shield to hold against a storm of grief and fury. It was a gamble. A wild, desperate, last-chance gamble. But it was the only move left on the board. Taking a deep breath to steady her hammering heart, she unbarred the door. The screech of the wood against the frame echoed in the silent night, a sound of profound finality. She left her pistol and rifle on the table, a deliberate, calculated act of trust she did not feel. In her right hand, she held the brass button. In her left, the scrap of paper with the charcoal drawing of the hoof print. She stepped out into the cold night air, into the full view of the warriors ringing the hill. A low, guttural murmur rippled through the assembled Pawnee. They had expected a cornered animal. They had expected gunshots from a darkened window. They had not expected this. A lone woman walking calmly out into the moonlight, unarmed, her face set like stone. She stopped on the small porch, her face illuminated by the moon, showing them she had nothing to hide. She held up her hands, palms open, showing them the objects she carried. Maka took a step forward, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What tricks are these?" "No tricks," Elsie said, her voice carrying in the still air, surprisingly strong and steady. "Only the truth." She started down the slope, slowly, one step at a time, moving directly toward him. Several of the younger warriors raised their bows, arrows nocked and ready to fly. Maka held up a hand, a sharp, commanding gesture, and they held their positions. He would hear her out, if only to savor her lies before he delivered his justice. When she was 20 feet from him, she stopped. "Your son," she began, her voice unwavering. "He was caught in a snare. I found him. I cut him free." "You lie," Maka said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He said the trapline woman hurt him." "The trap hurt him," Elsie corrected gently. "I freed him." She acted it out with her hands, mimicking the cutting of a wire. She pointed to her own ankle. "The trap." Then she made a motion like she was helping someone up from the ground. "I helped." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't belief, not yet, but it was a crack in his certainty. An older warrior, his face a mask of weathered wisdom, the man she would later know as Chata, stepped forward to stand beside Maka, his gaze intense and searching. Elsie took another slow step forward. "The trap," she said again, more forcefully this time. "It was not my trap." She opened her left hand, showing him the paper. She pointed to the sketch of the nicked horseshoe. "This is the mark of a shod horse, a white man's horse." She pointed toward Redemption Bluffs, from the town. Then she held up the brass button in her right hand. "This was on the ground near the trap. It is from the coat of a deputy, from the man who wants your land, the man who wants a war." Maka stared at the objects, his brow furrowed in a mixture of raw anger and growing confusion. Could it be true? Chata looked from the button to Elsie's face, his ancient eyes searching for any sign of deceit and finding none. The simple, clean narrative of vengeance was becoming complicated, muddied. It was at that precise moment of fragile, hanging tension that a new sound intruded. The thunder of shod horses, ridden hard and fast from the west. A posse of riders crested the hill, their forms stark and menacing against the starry sky. At their lead were two men, Sheriff Brody, looking pale and uncertain, his face a ghostly white in the moonlight, and Deputy Hiram Kane, his face set in a grim, triumphant smile. "There they are, Sheriff," Kane shouted, his voice ringing with a false, practiced heroism. "The savages have her surrounded. Let's save the poor woman." Kane had seen the gathering of the Pawnee just as he'd hoped. It was the perfect pretext. He could ride in like a hero, eliminate the Pawnee threat, and silence the only witness to his conspiracy, Elsie, in the ensuing chaos. A perfect, bloody solution. The Pawnee warriors instantly turned, bows raised, their attention shifting from Elsie to the new, more immediate threat. Maka's face hardened, his brief moment of doubt completely erased by the arrival of his true enemies. "See?" he spat at Elsie, gesturing with his lance toward the riders. "Your people have come to finish the job." "They are not my people," Elsie cried out, her voice filled with a new desperation. She was caught, literally, between two fires. Kane and his posse reined in, a dozen men raising their rifles, facing more than 30 Pawnee warriors. The air crackled, thick with the promise of imminent, bloody violence. "Drop your weapons, you heathens!" Kane bellowed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You're on settlement land." Maka let out a sharp, defiant war cry in response. Elsie looked from the proud, determined face of Maka to the treacherous, smiling face of Kane. She saw Sheriff Brody, wringing his hands, a man caught in a trap of his own cowardice. In that terrifying, frozen moment, Elsie knew that her life and the lives of every single person on that hill depended entirely on what happened in the next few seconds. The fuse had been lit at dawn. The explosion was coming now. The snare was his! Elsie's voice ripped through the tense standoff, raw and powerful. Every eye, settler and Pawnee alike, snapped to her. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at Hiram Kane. "He said it! On my line! He wants you to fight! He wants you all dead so he can have this land!" Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped the night air. "The woman's gone mad with fear, Sheriff. Look at her spouting nonsense. We need to put these savages down now." He raised his rifle to his shoulder, his movements fluid and quick. But he didn't take aim at Maka, or any of the Pawnee warriors. He aimed directly at Elsie. She was the loose end, the one person alive who could unravel his entire scheme. Sheriff Brody, standing right beside him, saw the move. He saw the cold, murderous intent flare in his deputy's eyes. Elsie's words, the button she'd mentioned in town, the way Kane had pushed and prodded for this exact confrontation, it all crashed down on Brody at once, a tidal wave of truth he could no longer ignore. "Hiram, no!" Brody yelled, his voice cracking. He reached out, a clumsy, desperate attempt to grab the rifle barrel. But he was too slow, and Hiram Kane was too late. Before Kane could pull the trigger, before Brody's hand could connect, something moved with impossible, blurring speed. Maka, seeing Kane aim at the woman he was finally, gut-wrenchingly beginning to believe, acted on pure, primal instinct. He didn't throw his lance or draw a knife. He lunged. He covered the distance between them in two powerful strides, a blur of motion, and tackled Kane with the force of a battering ram. The two men crashed to the ground in a savage tangle of limbs. Kane's rifle discharged into the night sky with a deafening roar, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding everyone. That single shot broke the spell. All hell broke loose. The posse, seeing their leader attacked, opened fire. The Pawnee, answering Maka's unspoken command, let their arrows fly. The night exploded into a chaotic, terrifying symphony of gunshots, war cries, and the wet, sickening thud of arrows finding their mark. It wasn't a battle line. It was a swirling, desperate melee under the cold, indifferent stars. Elsie threw herself to the ground, crawling behind a small rocky outcropping as bullets whizzed and snapped over her head. Through the dust and chaos, she saw Cha-Ta, the old elder, calmly directing the Pawnee archers, his voice a steadying influence, pointing out the most aggressive of the posse members. But this was not the easy massacre Kane had envisioned. The settlers in the posse were farmers and storekeepers, not soldiers. They had come expecting to intimidate a band of savages and play hero for a white woman. They had not expected a coordinated, ferocious defense, and they certainly hadn't expected their own deputy to be the first one to start the fight by trying to murder the woman they came to save. When a few of their number went down under the first volley of arrows, their courage evaporated. Seeing Sheriff Brody making no move to fight, instead just staring in horror at the brutal brawl on the ground, several men broke ranks, turned tail, and fled back toward the imagined safety of town. Maka and Kane were locked in a primal struggle. Kane, younger and wiry, fought with a desperate, dirty viciousness, clawing and biting, trying to pull his pistol. But Maka was driven by a righteous fury. He was fighting not just for his own life, but for the honor of his son and the future of his people. He smashed Kane's hand against a rock, sending the pistol skittering away into the dust. Kane's eyes went wide with pure terror as he realized his ambition had finally, fatally cornered him. Maka's face, painted for war and contorted with rage, was the last thing Hiram Kane ever saw. The fight was over almost as quickly as it began. With Kane down and half the posse fled, the remaining settlers threw down their guns, their hands raised high in surrender. The Pawnee warriors stood over them, bows still drawn, their chests heaving. Silence fell once more upon the hill, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the pathetic, terrified sobbing of one of the surrendering townsmen. Sheriff Brody, his face ashen in the moonlight, walked slowly, like a man in a trance, toward the center of the conflict. He looked at Kane's still body, then at Maka, who was getting to his feet, breathing heavily. Finally, his gaze settled on Elsie as she cautiously emerged from behind the rocks. She walked over and picked up the dropped brass button from the dust where she had let it fall. She held it out in her palm for the sheriff to see. "This fell from his coat," she said quietly. Brody didn't even need to look at it. He knew. He knew his silence, his weakness, his cowardice had almost cost all of them their lives. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with a shame so profound it seemed to crush him. "God help me, I know." Maka approached Elsie, his movements slow and deliberate. The fury was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, weary understanding. He looked at her, the lone woman who had stood her ground against two opposing forces, armed with nothing but the truth. He stopped before her and looked at the blood on his own hands, then back at her face. He spoke, not in English, but in the fluid, dignified cadence of his own tongue. Chata stepped forward, his voice soft, to translate. "The war chief says," Chata began, "that his anger made him blind. He came here for vengeance against an enemy, but he found an ally instead. You saved his son from the snare, and tonight you saved his people from a war. The debt is not yours to pay. The debt is his." Maka then gave a sharp command to his warriors. They did not leave. Instead, they fanned out, taking up new positions around the hill. They collected the settlers' weapons and began to tend to their own wounded. Two warriors helped the disgraced Sheriff Brody and his remaining men begin the grim task of dealing with the dead. Elsie stood, wrapped in the sudden, shocking quiet, and watched them. The tribe had gathered at her home at nightfall, just as she had feared. But they were not here to destroy her. They were here to protect her. They were standing guard, their silent forms a shield against the darkness of the world beyond her hill. A testament to a reckoning that had ended not in blood and fire, but in a fragile, hard-won truth, born under the vast, watchful eyes of the prairie stars. The hours that followed the violence were a strange and hollow eternity. The moon climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent, bathing the hill in a cold, analytical light that made the scene below look like a tableau from a waking nightmare. Elsie remained on her porch, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, a spectator to the quiet, efficient work of the Pawnee. They moved with a purpose that was both grim and respectful. Hiram Kane's body lay where he had fallen, a stark testament to his failed ambition. Sheriff Brody sat on a rock, his head in his hands, a broken man stewing in the juices of his own complicity. He hadn't fought, but he hadn't stopped it either. And that, Elsie knew, was a sin of a different, more insidious kind. The terror had burned away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a strange, unexpected sense of clarity. The Pawnee warriors were no longer a faceless threat. They were men. Their silent vigil around her cabin was not the act of a besieging army, but of a royal guard. She, the reclusive trapline woman, had somehow become a figure of significance to them. A person to be protected. Her simple, solitary life was over. The night had burned it away. As the eastern sky began to pale from inky black to a soft, bruised purple, a small council formed in the open space before her cabin. Maka stood tall, his war paint smeared by sweat and battle, his authority undiminished. Beside him, the elder Chata was a pillar of calm. Sheriff Brody was brought forward by two warriors, and he stumbled to a halt, his eyes avoiding everyone's. At a gesture from Maka, Elsie was beckoned to join them. She walked down the steps, the blanket still around her shoulders, and stood as an unlikely cornerstone in this meeting of two worlds. "The knight's blood is finished," Chata said, his voice the first to break the long silence. He spoke in Pawnee, then repeated it in English. "Now the day demands a reckoning." Maka's gaze fell upon Brody. It was not a look of hatred, but of cold, final assessment. "Your deputy is dead. He paid the price for his lies. These others," he gestured to the huddled group of captured townsmen, "they followed his poison. In our law, they would pay the same price." Brody flinched, finally looking up. "They're fools, not murderers. They were lied to." They were eager to believe the lies, Maka countered, his voice sharp. They came for our blood. Killing them will only prove Cain's lies to the people in town, Elsie said softly, stepping forward. Maka's eyes shifted to her, and the hardness in them softened, almost imperceptibly. It will start the war he wanted. Chata nodded slowly. The woman speaks with a wise tongue. More blood will only water the seeds of hate. A different price must be paid. For a long moment, Maka was silent. He was a war chief, and his instincts screamed for retribution. But he was also a leader, and he understood that the fragile victory they had won could be lost in a moment of vengeful pride. He made his decision. He issued a series of sharp commands in his own tongue. Two of his warriors went to Cain's body, and with a distinct lack of ceremony, tied his hands and feet to a long pole. Then they approached the captured settlers. The men cried out, thinking their end had come. But instead of killing them, the Pawnee stripped them of their rifles and ammunition belts, tossing them into a pile. Maka turned back to Brody. You will take your dead, and you will take your living. They will carry him, he said, nodding toward Cain's body. They will walk back to your town with no guns and with their shame for all to see. You will tell the town the truth. You will tell them who set the snare. You will tell them who fired the first shot. We will know if you lie. It was a brilliant stroke, a punishment far more potent than death. It was humiliation. It was the forced delivery of an unwelcome truth by the very men who had sought to bury it. Brody looked at the ground, then at Elsie, and finally met Maka's gaze. A flicker of his old authority, of the lawman he was supposed to be, returned to his eyes. I will, he said, his voice hoarse but firm. I'll tell them the truth. Maka gave a curt nod. He then approached Elsie. From a pouch at his belt, he withdrew a single perfect eagle feather, its tip dyed a deep symbolic red. He held it out to her. The spirit of the eagle sees the truth from on high. Chata translated. Maka gives this to you, so my people will always know you as a friend, as the woman who sees the truth. Elsie took the feather, its delicate structure feeling impossibly strong in her hand. Thank you, she whispered. There were no more words to be said. The Pawnee helped hoist the pole with Cain's body onto the shoulders of two of the posse members. Brody, his face a mask of grim resolve, marshaled his defeated men. They began the long, shameful walk back to Redemption Bluffs, a procession of failure led by a dead man. When the procession was a mere smudge on the horizon, Maka and his warriors began to depart, melting back into the ravines and draws of the prairie as silently as they had come. Elsie was left alone on the hill, the eagle feather clutched in her hand. The sun was now fully risen, flooding the prairie with clean, golden light, washing away the stench of gunpowder. Her cabin stood untouched. Her life was her own again. But it was a different life. The land felt the same, but her place in it had been forever changed. She was no longer just the trapline woman. She was a bridge, a truth teller, a guardian of a fragile peace, earned in a single night of violence and mercy. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that this long dawn was only the beginning. In the end, the story of Elizabeth Monroe and the Pawnee isn't just a tale from the Old West. It's a testament to the fact that real courage isn't always found in the thunder of a rifle, but often in the quiet, steady voice of truth speaking against a chorus of lies. It shows how one person's refusal to surrender to fear can untangle a web of hatred and deception, proving that understanding, however difficult, is a more powerful force than vengeance. The tribe that gathered for war remained as guardians, a silent acknowledgement that on the harsh frontier, alliances aren't forged by race or creed, but by character and honor. If this story of grit, drama, and unexpected justice from the American West captured your imagination, please do us a favor and give this video a like. It truly helps our channel grow. Share it with someone else who loves a powerful historical tale. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next story from the forgotten pages of history. Thank you for listening.